Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Keele University's Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences lecture this evening. My name is Jonathan Watling. I'm Executive Dean of Natural Sciences, but also have the pleasure of being Director of the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences at Keele. Ordinarily, of course, we'd have had a chance to meet each other and chat in the Great Hall at Keele. And I'm thinking back to many happy memories there. We've had a very relaxed time before, with a glass of something in our hand before we engage with the speaker, and of course with the bar open afterwards. Unfortunately, we're not in those times at the moment, but one of the advantages we do have is that we can reach out to a large and particularly diverse audience through our team's interaction here. So welcome this evening. We're really looking forward to Sarah's lecture. I know that some are out there. There's around 160 of you listening, which is great, and a particular welcome to our student body. Half of our audience this evening are students at Keele or at other institutions. So a particular welcome to you, and thank you for joining us. So before we start the lecture, just a few brief words of introduction for Sarah herself. Sarah is Chief Executive of the Carnegie UK Trust. That's an organisation which seeks to improve the lives and well-being of people across the UK and Ireland through influencing public policy and practice. And she's going to talk about that, obviously, as a central piece of her talk this evening. She joined the Trust in 2019 after 25 years in the civil service, latterly in the position of Director General roles in the Scottish Government. Sarah's made a CB for public service in 2019, and she's a fellow of the RSA. Sarah lives in Edinburgh and works across the UK and Ireland from the Carnegie Trust base, which is in Dunfermline in Scotland. So at the end of Sarah's lecture, she will be happy to take questions at the end. There's an opportunity for you as an audience to interact with those and interact with Sarah by posting the questions in the question box via your computer screen, and we'll deal with as many of those as we can at the end and at the end of the session. Not quite used to how we're normally, not quite as we would normally do it, but hopefully that will work well for us this evening. So Sarah's lecture this evening is entitled Has Wellbeing's Moment Finally Arrived? The Challenge of Making and Measuring Social Progress. And we're all aware, just in the times that we live, just how relevant and important that topic is. I can't say that we planned the COVID crisis just to make Sarah's lecture even more relevant, but I'm sure there will be more than a passing reference to the current situation that we are all in at the moment. So welcome, Sarah. It's a pity I can't see you face to face. It is a little bit of an odd experience, and we've already extended an invitation for you to come to Keele and see us and meet us face to face at some stage in the future. But without further ado, I'm now going to ask Sarah to take the stage, as it were, the virtual stage, and I'm going to hand over to Sarah for this evening's lecture. So welcome, Sarah, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, so much for that introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you this evening, not sadly with the Keele community in body, but certainly in spirit. I have actually visited your university campus once in the past, and I hope that gives me some sense of connection from here in Edinburgh that extends beyond the broadband one that we must all rely on for this evening's communications. And as always, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it doesn't let us down. I am grateful and honoured to have been invited to give this lecture. Your tradition of grand challenges explicitly embraces the complexity of the modern world. At the heart of your framing of these lectures as interdisciplinary opportunities is the understanding that such challenges cannot be solved by a single discipline acting alone. And the fact that you extend the invitation to your wider community is a marker of the rootedness of the university in its place and an interest in knowledge made useful. And this all feels extremely apt for what I intend to talk to you about for the next 35 minutes or so. Because the grand challenge that interests me and my organisation is no less than that of social progress itself. How we understand it, how we measure it, how we communicate it, and how we make the most of this current moment to accelerate it. To amplify that slightly, I will be offering you a brief introduction to the history of wellbeing in its public policy context, insights into some of the ways in which some governments, both national and international, have tried to take this more holistic approach, a deep dive into some new work that we have recently published on an alternative measure of social progress, codenamed GDWE, some observations on opportunities for advancing the wellbeing debate through the lens of the pandemic, and then finally at the end I want to reflect on the role of the philanthropic organisation in this space. What is our role, and maybe more importantly our legitimacy in this conversation about what governments should do? But first of all, I want to start by saying something briefly about the Carnegie UK Trust, and in doing so perhaps to present my organisational credentials on this subject. The Carnegie UK Trust was founded by Andrew Carnegie back in 1913 with a remit, as Jonathan said, to improve the well-being of the masses of the UK and Ireland. Carnegie has been described as the father of modern philanthropy, and indeed at the time that the UK Trust was established there were no comparable trusts or foundations anywhere in the whole of the UK. The only trust of a similar size at all was what is now the Trust for London, and its trustee limited it to working in the capital. Until 2004, the Carnegie Trust operated principally through grant giving, like many other such foundations that you might be familiar with, and throughout that time it engaged with the prevailing challenges of the day, as were experienced by individuals, communities and the society at large. It's interesting to look back in the records which show that successive trustees also wrestled over those decades with what was actually meant by well-being and how best to discharge the mission that Carnegie had given them. In 2004, the then Board of Trustees made a major decision to become what is known as an operating trust, and that's a charitable organisation that funds its operations through the income from its investments, as opposed to disbursing that income through grants to other organisations. And that's the point when the Trust defined its role, again as Jonathan said a moment ago, as seeking to influence public debate, public policy and practice. One of Carnegie's most significant bequests to the UK Trust wasn't so much his money, but his explicit permission and encouragement to trustees to undertake regular reviews of the best way to pursue their mission. And that was so to ensure that the opportunities and the challenges of the day were responded to. In other words, that we could respond for 2020, as opposed to constantly responding through the framing of the first part of last century. And that flexibility meant that when in 2009, there was a significant development in the international public policy world, the Trust could grasp that opportunity to refocus its mission to improve well-being for at least the decade to come. And this has created the context for our contribution to public debate, public policy and public policy practice ever since. That seminal event in 2009 was the publication of the report of the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, a bit of a mouthful otherwise known ever since as the Stiglitz Report. Many of you here may know about the background and output of that commission, often referred to as Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi. It came in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis and was established by the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy to advise on how better to measure progress in the economy and society. The unifying theme of that report was that the time was then ripe for our measurement system to shift the emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being. This critique of GDP as the sole or the primary index of success was not a new one. It's a much used quote in well-being circles, but Robert Kennedy said as long ago as 1968 that GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And most notably, since the 1970s, there has been increasing concern expressed that GDP does not adequately account for household work, for informal caring activities, for volunteering, for environmental damage, for health outcomes and inequality, to name but a few. And the second quote that I hope you can see on the slide here from Mark Carney's Reith Lectures of last year brings that critical commentary right up to date. It's therefore important to recall that the work of the last decade on this issue sits in a much longer tradition of international and UK wellbeing initiatives that goes back over 50 years. These didn't all adopt the specific term wellbeing, and other terminology that you may have heard includes sustainable development, new economies, beyond GDP, and so on. But while the language varies, if you look underneath that, most of them share the key elements and ideas in common. But I do recognise that the terminology can cause some confusion. So it's probably appropriate, before I go any further, to take a moment to define my terms. When I refer to well-being for the remainder of this lecture, I will be talking about a way of understanding social progress. There are two concepts of measuring and understanding social progress as well-being. The first is personal, otherwise known as eudaimonic well-being. That's measuring the quality of one's life through subjective measures of life satisfaction and happiness. And the other is societal well-being, a set of measures, both objective and subjective, that are generally understood by a society as forming the essential components of well-being. These include objective measures such as educational attainment and income levels, and subjective ones such as people's perception of crime or their satisfaction with public services. There are, of course, other concepts of well-being in social policy, or the term is used in social policy most commonly to refer to mental health or public health more broadly. And in the wider public mind, well-being can mean anything from yoga retreats and green juice to the fitness app that you wear on your wrist. The well-being, or sometimes called wellness industry, has flourished in recent years, for good and for ill. And it probably leads most people to have a working concept of what well-being is, that's somewhat removed from what Andrew Carnegie was thinking of when he founded the Trust at the turn of last century. However, it is these two concepts of personal well-being and societal well-being that are used to describe the ultimate goals of social progress and what it is that the role of government should be in seeking and securing that outcome. And it's this inquiry that has shaped the work of the UK Trust over a decade and more, ever since the publication of Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi's report. And here I must pay tribute to important work done by my colleagues and predecessors at the Trust, since I only joined them towards the end of 2019. It is on their foundational contribution that I am drawing this evening. And we do know a lot more about well-being than we did when we started on this journey of discovery. You can see here that the model which we have developed over the years is both multidimensional and multi-layered. It identifies 4 domains of well-being: social, economic, environmental and democratic, and 3 interconnected layers of well-being: the personal, the community and the societal. Community and societal well-being are more than simply the aggregate life satisfaction of citizens, but they can't be said to exist in the absence of that personal life satisfaction. Each dimension and layer of well-being can be measured, both objectively and subjectively, and measurement is something I'll come back to shortly. The science of well-being has developed significantly over the past 10 years, particularly with the development of international databases on subjective well-being that now allow social scientists to begin to say with some confidence what the key drivers of well-being are. There's also now a wealth of qualitative studies that explore why different variables have an impact on well-being, why it is that certain groups do better or worse in society. We know, for example, that the key factors in relation to personal well-being are personal relationships, the absence of poverty, health, education, shelter, safety, unemployment, and the experience of freedom or personal agency. Community well-being is less studied on its own terms, and as a result our current understanding of it is less developed, with significant gaps in our knowledge in this area. But what we do know highlights the significance of pockets of deprivation and what are sometimes called left behind places, of social capital and of community assets. At the level of societal well-being, governments clearly have a key role to play. Basic services and the amount that is invested in these impacts on subjective and objective wellbeing indicators. We also know that actions by government to reduce inequality have the effect of improving personal wellbeing, while wealth inequality is a significant and long-standing barrier to societal wellbeing. The other issues which appear significant at a societal level are environmental protections and the securing of democratic accountability. Given the territory covered there, it is perhaps not surprising that the concept of well-being as social progress has been developed by those governments across the world who have been attracted to taking a more rounded approach. Now, what I've been talking about so far is pretty theoretical. The challenge to these administrations then becomes how to take the theory and translate it into practice. In other words, how do you actually make progress, rather than simply describing a different way of thinking about it? Well, as students of public administration will be well aware, by the mid-2000s we were seeing a shift in many places away from new public management orthodoxy towards whole-of-government approaches to public policy, which we call wellbeing approaches. Countries such as Canada, New Zealand, and closer to home, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland started to plan and describe their policy aims using wellbeing frameworks, with a focus on outcomes rather than on inputs or targets. These outcomes were ideally ones which reflected gathered citizens' views of what constitutes wellbeing, and they're pursued over a number of years, often extending beyond political administration terms, reflecting the time needed to achieve significant change. Indicators track progress towards the outcomes set out in these frameworks. What you can see on the slide here is the Scottish Wellbeing Outcomes Framework, the National Performance Framework, now on its second iteration since its inception in 2017. 11 outcomes supporting a purpose and with values at the centre. There's a similar framework in Wales, thanks to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act there, and another in development in the form of Northern Ireland's draft programme for government. This visual representation of a wellbeing approach illustrates the balancing or rebalancing by government of social, economic, environmental and democratic outcomes. Putting such a framework into operation brings into play another distinctive mark of a wellbeing approach, namely what we call horizontal integration, a rejection of the traditional siloed up and down model of government in favour of true collaboration between different policymakers who each have a contribution to make to the societal outcome. Where this is working properly, you would see, for example, housing, education, early years, transport, planning, treasury and health officials all working together to address the root causes of systemic health inequalities, rather than this being seen as the sole or primary responsibility of the health ministry. At the heart of this is a recognition that individual outcomes, such as those set out in the Scottish NPF, are incapable of being realised by any one function of government working in isolation. These are complex challenges requiring collaborative solutions. The same principle goes for vertical integration or localism. New relationships between central and local government or third sector organisations based on a shared set of outcomes allow central government to do what only it can do and the local agencies to tailor delivery to the needs and priorities of their communities. To reinforce this, legislative duties are sometimes put in place. The Welsh Act places a duty on public bodies, such as local authorities, health boards, national libraries and museums, to put long-term sustainability at the heart of their approach, working collaboratively and drawing on concepts such as prevention, integration, inclusivity and long-term strategic thinking. This highlights the fact that a well-being approach is one which emphasises the critical importance of preventative investment, identifying problems and responding to them before the cost of failing to do so becomes too great for the public purse and for overall well-being. And finally, but importantly, a well-being approach is a participative one. Social progress cannot be understood without engaging people about what matters to them, and there are significant wellbeing outcomes themselves associated with engaging people in the co-design of policies and services which are relevant to them. In describing these core elements of putting a wellbeing approach into practice, I've moved one step along from theory to practice, but it's still an incomplete picture if it does not also take account of the political and power dynamics, or of how effective change actually happens in any large, complex organisation. Technocratic approaches may be necessary in order to put some key building blocks in place, but they are very far from sufficient. Anyone who has ever worked in government or made a study of it will recognise that there is a built-in challenge to the kinds of horizontal and vertical integration that I described a moment ago. Government is traditionally organised around ministries or departments, and the interplay of personal politics, large and small p, as well as what are perceived as efficiencies or simplicity, have driven a silo-based framework for the development and implementation of policy for many, many decades. Even where wellbeing frameworks have been in situ for many years, there is still some way to go to see them fully embedded in organisational culture and everyday practice. Long-term thinking and investing also tend to go against the grain of other prevailing forces. The speed of the news cycle and other pressures tend to promote the quick fix or the announcement of the quick fix ahead of the hard slog of systemic change. And finally, while we have seen some interesting recent experiments in citizen participation in the UK, the relationship between deliberative and representative democracy is still a contested one. This might sound like a counsel of despair, but it's not intended as such. Rather, it's a recognition that if we want to achieve change in the way that we pursue social progress, we need to accept that it requires multifaceted, multi-layered change. This means understanding the blend of legislative, regulatory, technical, political and emotional psychological factors which need to be brought into play, and drawing on these as appropriate to support a shift to wellbeing. Clearly, a very significant part of this concerns how we speak about public policy and about social progress, and critically, how governments choose to communicate with the public about progress against their chosen set of outcomes and indicators. This is a much less developed area, even in those countries which were early adopters of wellbeing frameworks. Even where dashboards do exist, the data tends not to capture the public attention, let alone imagination, and often feels detached from the day-to-day business of political and media discourse. UK government ministers certainly don't routinely point us as citizens towards the ONS wellbeing dashboard, despite the fact that it claims to reveal how we are doing as citizens, as individuals, as communities and as a nation, and how sustainable this is for the future. Does this matter? Well, I think it does, insofar as it determines whether political administrations feel that they will be held to account for progress on the outcomes they have set out, and because it has an important impact on the nature of public discourse and our understanding about society. And that poses a challenge, because no matter how participative the development of the outcomes framework, and no matter how salient the individual components of it may be to people's lives and concerns, we all live in a very loud and a very busy public square where it is difficult to cut through. By contrast, which item can you pretty much guarantee will lead the national news headlines at least 4 times a year and as regular as clockwork? The quarterly and monthly GDP figures have a position in the public consciousness which far outstrips the value that they actually add to our understanding of the overall health of our society and the progress that we make on that front. Over a long period of time, GDP has taken centre stage in the minds of the public and of policymakers as the critical measure of progress. However, as I've already set out, we know that this measure has significant limitations. The challenge laid down by the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission was critically one about measurement. As the Commission itself said, what we measure affects what we do, and if our measurements are flawed, decisions may be distorted. Stiglitz himself deplored what he called GDP fetishism. Along with the adoptions of outcomes frameworks for policy development over the past decade, some governments have tried to adopt new methods of measurement and progress reporting as well. The OECD responded to Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi by creating their influential Better Life Index, which measures societal well-being across a range of indicators, including housing, civic engagement and life satisfaction. Here in England, the ONS Wellbeing Dashboard I referred to a minute ago was developed in 2011 as a response to David Cameron's government's pledge to devise a new way of measuring well-being in Britain. However, it has not yet had a visible influence on policy making in Whitehall, and the UK government still appears to look primarily to GDP when it wants to talk to the public about progress. This matters for the reasons that Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi set out, and which bear repeating. What we measure affects what we do, and if our measurements are flawed, decisions may be distorted. We at Carnegie UK are interested in the influence that this powerful GDP figure has managed to wield, and we became increasingly convinced that there was a connection between the simplicity and the clarity of that communication tool and the continued primacy of economic progress in policy making. We therefore set out to demonstrate whether it was possible to create a credible alternative measure which would be more effective than the current ONS dashboard of different data sets, bringing all the data together to create a single figure of well-being. Ideally, this overall metric could be used to clearly show the difference between GDP performance and well-being performance, but also crucially, it could be tracked over time to tell whether well-being is going up or is going down. If we could achieve this, then we believe that it might be easier to refocus policy priorities when thinking about social progress. We commissioned statistical experts to work with us, and late last year we're very pleased to be able to unveil what we are calling GDWE, the first time that a powerful single figure has been produced for gross domestic well-being in England. We used this to map its progress against that of GDP for the past 5 years. It's worth noting at this point that we recognise that there are both advantages and disadvantages in creating a score of this kind. Influencing decision-making by providing a communications tool that summarises a wide range of data into one single figure could have significant benefits for policymaking, but it also has its limitations. GDWE requires the consistent measurement and collection of data, and as it is largely quantitative in nature, it could ignore some of the more qualitative stories that lie behind the statistics and the figures. Issues of sensitivity to equalities issues also arise due to the sampling sizes and the methods of collection. Nonetheless, by offering this alternative measure of social progress, we are for the first time offering a single measure that highlights the disparity between priorities across the different domains of well-being and, we hope, provides a useful framework for those advocating change in this area. We believe that GDWE can help to promote a more balanced and holistic understanding of complex social issues. Now, I don't pretend to expertise in the statistical methods, but I will say something briefly about how GDWE was created for those of you who are. It is important to be clear that we did not select these measures. They were selected by the Office of National Statistics themselves after extensive expert and public consultation. This is essential for the validity of the ONS work and for the index that we derived from it. The ONS Measures of National Wellbeing Dashboard outlines 10 areas of life, or domains, and these are the central coloured wheel that you can see on the slide. You probably can't read any of the detail, but those domains are personal well-being, our relationships, health, what we do, where we live, personal finance, economy, education and skills, governance and environment. The geographic scope of the analysis is England, as this is where the data was more consistently available. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all have separate wellbeing dashboards, and we therefore did not include them in this analysis. The data within the ONS dashboard includes both subjective and objective data collected from a range of sources. There are 41 indicators on the dashboard. Those are the spokes you see radiating out from the hub of the wheel. And to create a single number, a series of calculations was required. Firstly, the data was normalised so it could be compared and displayed in a way that indicated its relative position and its change over time. These were then combined to create one score for each domain. The domain scores were then combined to give an overall GDW score. As is the case, of course, with GDP, this score represents whether gross domestic well-being, the sum total of all the measured well-being in a society, is increasing or decreasing over time. This is indicated by a percentage when mapped against GDP and is a score out of 10 otherwise. So, having done all of this, what was the big reveal? In 2018 to 19, the score for gross domestic well-being, measured on the 10-point scale, was 6.89. As can be seen on the slide, GDW improved between 2013-14 and 15-16 and remained steady for a further 2 years before slowing a slight dip in 18-19. There's only a small variance of 0.44 between the highest and lowest scores across this 6-year period. However, the graph clearly shows that GDW, as a broader reflection of societal well-being, has stagnated and perhaps begun a downward trend. The trend in the GDW score is particularly stark when plotted against GDP. The graph on this slide plots the growth of GDW as a percentage from a baseline of 6.55 in 13-14, with GDP from a baseline of 1941155. In the 5 years between the baseline and the latest available data in 18-19, GDW increased by 5.19%. Over the same time frame, GDP increased by 10.34%. This analysis shows that well before the COVID pandemic hit, our well-being was lagging behind economic growth. The overall picture of gross domestic well-being helps us to better understand social progress as a whole, and in particular, how overall policy making is framed around GDP rather than around the well-being data. However, as with any index outputs, there are risks in examining single figures as it can oversimplify the output. As I said, GDW is comprised of 40 indicators spread across the 10 ONS domains of well-being. This slide shows the range of values that make up the score for 2018-19. The results for personal well-being, what we do, where we live, governance and the environment are all less than the overall GDW score. The reverse is true with regard to our relationships, personal finances, the economy and education and skills, while health sits very close to the final score of 6.89. And of course, we see exactly the same if we look into the detail of what makes up the GDP index figure. Some sectors doing better than average, while others performing worse. The final thing I want to add to this story is the analysis that we undertook to complement the statistical output. Recognising some of the limitations of the ONS data, we undertook a qualitative thematic review of the main commissions and inquiries that were undertaken in and relevant to England since 2010. We did this because we wanted to understand the predominant focus of the prominent thinkers on well-being who contributed to those commissions and inquiries, and to see which themes and issues of importance for social progress reoccurred frequently within their recommendations. In addition, our quantitative analysis suggested that there were several gaps, not just in the data being collected under the current categories, but in the themes of well-being themselves. For example, the governance domain includes data on voter turnout and trust in government, but no information at all on citizen engagement or participation, or if individuals feel that they can influence key decisions that impact their lives, which is something that we know is of fundamental importance to well-being. We knew that these commissions and inquiries would have amassed and generated an enormous amount of evidence, and we thought their recommendations might have the effect of shedding light on where those gaps remained. As well as revealing the sheer number of those bodies, 48 separate ones generating over 873 recommendations to government, we did indeed find a significant number of gaps, In other words, recommendations relating to outcomes or indicators which do not appear in the current ONS set. This analysis also highlighted 6 areas of cross-cutting recommendations which we believe could guide decision-making by policymakers and underpin a future wellbeing approach. These 6, prevention, participatory democracy, equalities, localism, integration of services and long-termism, could usefully help with option appraisal as policymakers grapple with the choices before them and help to answer more of that how question. So what next for GDW? Well, we were interested to see whether a single figure could animate public discourse in a way that the dashboard fails to. We certainly stimulated good debate on social media, with plenty of our fellow travellers in the public policy world taking an interest. But it's fair to say we didn't ignite much interest in the mainstream media, or so far apparently with policymakers themselves. However, we were glad to have the work recognised by a number of people who have themselves been thinking deeply about how we make and measure social progress. And I'm just going to end this section of my talk by sharing a few of the responses that we received on the next couple of slides. That final quote that you see there from David Isaac frames well what I want to say next about the significance of well-being in the post-COVID context. Much of what I've said so far this evening could probably have been delivered in identical form at this point in 2020. And it's therefore really important to add some observations about why opening up this debate about social progress matters now in 2021, arguably even more than it did before. It's too early to see the impact of the pandemic yet on the overall score in the GDW index, but a summary of the most recent data suggests some key areas of concern. Given what we know already, we should expect to see pandemic impacts show up in the ONS wellbeing data via the labour force survey, the ratings of life satisfaction, happiness and anxiety, trust in national governments, public debt and inflation, leisure satisfaction, physical activity and arts engagement. Time will tell, but already everything that the data and experience is telling us suggests that the impact of COVID on personal, community and societal well-being is going to be profound. A lot has been said by many people, including by us at Carnegie, about building back better. Very often that aspiration to better is trying to capture and respond to some of the insights that the pandemic has given us. The pattern of inequalities revealed by the ravages of COVID-19 were all there before March 2020, whether inequalities of health, wealth, education, ethnicity, disability or employment status. Themes that have dominated media and public discussion this year all have their roots in the pre-pandemic world, trust or otherwise in governments, the strength of local democracy versus central control, the quality of neighbourhoods, and the uneven distribution of social capital and resources. The difference of this moment is that the interconnectedness of all of these issues has been laid bare. Our assertion that the different aspects of well-being are intrinsically interlinked has been brought back into focus for many people. Our health, wealth and happiness are all connected, as are the social, economic and democratic outcomes for society. There is no economy without a healthy population, and in the same way there is no healthy population without systems for ensuring that basic needs are met on the foundation of a sustainable ecology and environment. And that's why the crude caricature of decisions currently facing governments across the world as an economy versus public health face-off is an example of the reductive narrative associated with the absence of a holistic approach to well-being. You simply can't have one without the other. And that's why I argue that if governments anywhere are serious about building back better, then they need to embrace a conversation, a goal, a framework, and an overall approach that puts well-being at the centre. The other reason why now feels like an important moment is that while unlooked for and absolutely unwelcome in itself, the pandemic has made some things possible in the UK, which previously seemed impossible. And some of those things are strongly correlated with what we know about well-being. For example, the pandemic has accelerated horizontal integration at local level, as local authorities and community and social sector organisations overcame all sorts of pre-existing barriers to meet the needs of families and individuals in crisis. It has provoked awareness of long-term risk and resilience and heightened our understanding of the connection between unfettered growth and ecological and environmental degradation. It's prompted conversations about the long-term sustainability of our health and care systems and about those paid the least in our society, which normally struggle to cut through beyond policy experts and activists. And I think at a very personal level, for each of us as individuals, we have had cause to reflect on those things that contribute to our own well-being and that of our families and our immediate communities. So the hope and plea for now must be this: don't forget those moments of insight, the lights that were shone and the issues that began to be understood. Building back better must be about wedging open that door and arguing with even more conviction that the business of governing is, in essence, the business of securing multilateral social progress. Finally this evening, I want to say something brief about the role of the endowed philanthropic institution in this particular part of the public square. A lot has been said and written in recent years about the undemocratic and possibly overweening power of philanthropy. This is particularly the case in the US, where the perceived influence of wealthy individuals on political actors and on institutions has come under close and often deservedly hostile scrutiny. But elsewhere in the world too, there is a growing sense that foundations need to be transparent and that it is entirely legitimate to subject their activities to some degree of scrutiny. Alongside this, there is an ongoing debate about the value of plurality in public policy making. Where do governments go to source the kind of longer term or more radical thinking that is often hard to incentivise within an existing system? How do we develop a shared language about change and progress, which enables government and civil society to truly understand each other? What is the most appropriate posture for public policy organisations to adopt in our engagements with government? Critical friend or just critic? Well, having personally been on both sides of that particular policy table, I am a convinced advocate of maximising the dialogue between governments, particularly those with progressive ideas, and those who have the resources to help them develop these into frameworks and strategies for action. But it's also incumbent on those of us jostling for a place at the policy table to join up our own thinking and not to be precious about the particular language used or the particular model that we developed. All of these things, including those I've spoken about this evening, are offered in the spirit of wanting to collaborate while learning together and not because we want to own the space. And they are offered transparently on an equal footing to all who are interested in joining the conversation. Some of the Carnegie UK Trust's earliest work on developing these wellbeing approaches identified the importance of movement building and asserting the legitimacy and indeed criticality of governments engaging with citizens and civil society about what matters to us all. The role of encouraging, facilitating and hosting those conversations can be a useful space for the foundation sector to inhabit, privileged as we are to be beholden to no one. I think there's a space also here for the civic university to explore at a local or a regional level. And that nicely brings me back full circle to the nature of grand challenges. Like societal outcomes, they can't be solved by any one actor or one sector or one thinker working alone. The grand challenge for the wellbeing movement, which we invite everyone to join, is this. It is to encourage policymakers everywhere to ask what matters, to know what matters, to prioritise what matters, to measure what matters, and to report on what matters. That is a simple prescription for governing a society that wants to make progress and to know what progress it is making. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for that really fascinating lecture. I'm sure we have all really enjoyed that. A lot of questions are popping up on my dashboard at the moment, so I hope you're happy to take a few of them this evening. Just to remind participants, if you want to ask a question, please do so. Pop it into the Q&A box. If you could keep your questions, as we would even in a in-person event, as short and as brief and to the point as possible, then we'll be able to get through as many as possible with Sarah. Unfortunately, it's a lot harder to do the sort of dialogue and discussion that we would ordinarily have with a live audience, well, with an audience in the same room, but we'll do our best to get through. So thanks so much, Sarah. Just while colleagues and participants are getting their questions together, if we could just start off with Chair's prerogative and just with a brief question just about GDWE and its I guess the potential for looking how valid is that measure as we go further back in historical analysis? I mean, is it your analysis obviously on your graphs only went back sort of 7 or 8, 10 years or so. Can we extrapolate those measures back to much earlier times, early in the 20th century, early in maybe even the 19th century, where to either sort of shed light on the polar views people have about life in the past always being better, and actually we looked after each other, and society was better and everything else, and generally things were better, against the other view that, well, actually, if you take a lot of measurables, it was pretty awful living 100 years ago, and we should just, although it's very difficult at the moment, we should just cheer ourselves up and be grateful we weren't born in the 19th century. Maybe a bit of a trivial question, but I just wonder how valid are those measures? Or are they really only designed to be looking in really contemporary times?
So thanks, and I don't think it is. I think it's a question that sheds light on a number of really interesting aspects about these measures, and that is the extent to which, at any one time, they represent what society at that time deemed to be important. And I think, therefore, we have to be quite careful not to make assumptions about what constituted either individual or societal well-being in a different era. I think we have to be particularly cautious about the measures of subjective well-being, and that's partly because measures of subjective well-being so much relate to what we expect in our lives now, the extent to which the culture around us, our upbringing, influences our sense of subjective well-being. And I think one of the other things that's interesting about is the extent to which we know, and research shows, that people will often feel subjectively well, as for their subjective well-being may be good in circumstances which are objectively not good. And I think that's where, if we were able to go back in time, it would be particularly interesting when there was a much even greater, we talk about very significant inequalities today, but of course, if we were to go back 100 years, we would see some very different, significant difference in terms of material well-being and material wealth between different sections of the population. But the expectation into which people were born and the expectations they had of their personal well-being and their personal likelihood of success would have been so shaped by their circumstances that it would again be interesting if we were able to draw conclusions about the gap between objective measures of well-being, educational attainment being a very good one, as well as health outcomes and people's own sense of well-being by their own terms. So I think we have to be cautious about doing it. But I think it's quite interesting now that we have this data, that we'll be able to look back to it from another future and start to answer those questions with a little bit more evidence than we can do looking backwards, as you're suggesting just now.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That's really helpful. And I appreciate the subjective nature to that. And actually, I think what came across really powerful in your talk is, really we ought to be looking forward, and it's how can we really use these measures to really understand how we can develop a better society, going forward. So, thanks very much. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the question and answer box coming through at the moment. I'm going to start with the first one. I think you've partly answered it already in the last part of your talk, but just if you want to add anything to it, I think that would be helpful. So this is commenting on the Trust's commitment to reviewing its own mission and policies to contribute to policy discussions of social progress and well-being, and whether or not other present-day philanthropic organisations should continue to learn from the steer that Andrew Carnegie gave your trust in the first place. I guess the answer is going to be yes to that, but you might want to expand a little bit. I know that was partly related to what you were saying at the end of your talk.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important point, and one that is worth making. It's quite interesting to look back over the history of the Trust, the Carnegie Trust, over 100 years now, where you see very clearly the history of the 20th century written in decisions that the Trust took about what mattered most for well-being at that time. And the ability to adapt and to be flexible clearly served the Trust well, and meant that it wasn't, as I think one of the former trustees said, fossilised in the thinking of the very first part of the century. I have only been in the foundation sector now for coming up 2 years, and I have already been really struck by the extent to which many foundations in the UK are asking some quite fundamental questions of their purpose and mission when faced with the challenges that are in front of them, particularly challenges of inequalities and social justice, but other challenges too. And recognising that if you're not able to be flexible and adaptive to the issues of today, then it is very likely that you're not going to be doing as much good as the founder that originally endowed you wished to do. And that's a constant challenge for trustees, I think. And it's particularly a challenge for grant-making foundations, which may have a long tradition of supporting certain activities. And that's particularly an issue where trusts and foundations have worked in particular places. And the final thing I'll say about that is that there's some very interesting work being done over the last few years to identify what people call cold spots in the UK, where despite their objective levels of need, they are often untouched by the hand of any foundation at all, because so many organisations become used to working with people that they've always worked with and in places that they've always worked with. So I see it as a very encouraging thing that's happening at the moment, that the sector is taking a good look at itself and considering how it can really maximise its impact and collaborate as well, which is another key point.
Thanks very much. I've got a question here, an interesting question from Fergus Smith, and it's around the role of democratic accountability as a requisite factor in well-being. So I think what Fergus is pointing out here is that, does this mean that societal well-being can only be applied to first world, or I guess democratic nations, or can it be that other areas, other parts of the world that actually don't have what we would recognise as the same sort of democracy foundations that we enjoy here, actually could do quite well on this measure? I mean, he highlights, one or two countries that might pertain to. So how important is that democratic measure? I suppose this is the concept of the benign dictatorship, where everything is absolutely perfect, but it all runs under dictatorship.
Yeah. So I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm going to say at the outset, although I will add a couple of other comments, it's not one that I feel I got any expertise to offer, except to note that the choice of what matters in different places varies quite significantly from place to place and culture to culture and time to time, as I was saying in response to your first question, Jonathan. And therefore the balance between the way in which different outcomes play out will also be different in different places. The evidence that we have for those countries or regions which have tried to put a wellbeing approach into place shows that democratic outcomes are very important. But to the best of my knowledge, those experiments are all in places which are democracies. And therefore, we should maybe be hesitant before drawing too many conclusions from that. But I'm aware in saying that it may well be that my colleagues who know more about this than I do would have some better evidence behind the kind of fundamental nature of the democratic domain. The one thing I would say is that we have observed in some of the conversations that we have had about well-being as an approach internationally, that people tend to talk about the importance of democratic outcomes far more readily and naturally in places where those are perceived to be under some threat, as opposed to places where they are not. And up until about a year or so ago, democratic outcomes didn't feature very much in the conversations that we were having about what we did in this country. And when you asked people in focus groups or in citizens' assemblies what mattered to them, they tended not to talk about democratic outcomes, which to a large extent, I suspect, was because we take our democratic freedoms so much for granted in this country. And we have noticed that just over the last year, I think very much in the light of events in the United States, people have started to talk about the importance of democratic outcomes and the ability to feel confident in your democratic structures much more than had been the case beforehand. So I recognise that last part is not a direct answer to the question, but I thought it might be of interest when thinking about the democratic quadrant of the wellbeing framework.
Thanks very much. And the next question is from Jeff Mackey, who has a question around the COP26 and some of the SDGs. So given that the G7 and COP26 are coming to the UK, he wants to know whether your work lends itself to being filtered through the lens of the UN SDGs, which policymakers are perhaps much more likely to be aware of during 2021.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we're thinking quite a lot about that at the moment. I can't remember, I don't think it was visible from the slide that I showed of the Scotland's National Performance Framework, but it actually maps onto the SDGs, and on the bigger version of it you can see the relationship between the two. And the OECD's framework for measuring is also very closely connected to the SDGs. It's interesting that in the past, experience has suggested that the language of sustainable development and SDGs, particularly of sustainable development, tended to be seen as being something just for people interested in environmental issues, and was sometimes an impediment to engaging people in a wider discussion about well-being. I think there's a very interesting shift happening at the moment as people become ever more aware of the challenges posed by the climate crisis, such that environmental issues, rather than being seen as being over there somewhere for other people to think about, are really coming front and centre. And therefore, for organisations like ours, which have not traditionally engaged so much on environmental sustainability and ecology, there's a bit of catch up to be doing, and we're thinking about it quite carefully at the moment to make sure that we don't miss opportunities to use the vehicle of discussions about climate and broader sustainability to land some of what we want to say about well-being. And I think that's where this issue that I ended with, of saying it's important not to be precious about the language and to find what the right language is for the right audience and to use it.
Thanks very much. And a question which is a little bit technical, but I can see, I think where it's coming from, which is around, is it possible to integrate a GDW score, which you measure longitudinally, into parallel selected community stories of progress or resilience and development? And this, I think the notion here from this question is this might be part of the communications challenge, which might help people get more interested in the measurement itself.
Yeah, I agree strongly with that. We believe quite passionately at Carnegie in the importance of community story. We've done quite a lot of work with communities actually during the COVID crisis to collect stories and to help communities tell their stories. And we were really conscious. We were conscious when we spent time with our heads down in the stats of GDW that we were in some ways missing that qualitative story of people's experience. And I do agree that the bringing together of what matters to people, their experience of their lives, their experience of the last year, what it means to live well in their communities, what it means for society to be healthy in the broadest sense. I think you absolutely have to bring that together with the numbers in order to bring it to life. And I think that is very likely to be the next stage of our exploration of telling this story.
I know we've got at least one Vice-Chancellor signed up for this lecture, so he may well be on the line. And I'm wondering if it's come from him, but it may have come from somebody else. It's a simple question, because I know Vice-Chancellors are very interested in this, which is, can you say something about the idea of the Civic University, and has its moment arrived?
Yes, so the Carnegie Trust has been involved in supporting the Civic University movement over a number of years. And that, for us, comes from two places of our interest. One is our interest in place and our belief that strong, healthy places are places where all the anchor institutions, to use the technical term, feel genuinely invested in what is happening and contribute to the health and well-being of that place. But it also comes from our interest in knowledge made useful and how research can, when appropriate, be rooted in people's experience and actually developed with and shared with people. And the best place for that to happen is in a place. I've been really interested in the engagement that I've had with civic universities over the last year in particular, actually to see how quickly that thinking is accelerating. And that itself may suggest that the moment has arrived. I think that in some of the particularly larger cities in England, where spatial planning has started happening on a bigger scale than has been the case in past, particularly in the metropolitan areas, the role of the university in contributing to policy development and policy implementation around place development is really exciting. And the ways that universities are bringing all sorts of resources as an employer locally, as an educator locally, as a consumer locally, all of these things are, I think, very, very redolent of opportunity. And I'm very excited by the civic university movement. And if this is its moment, then hallelujah.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm just going to finish with one question, which I've got to just draw together a couple of themes I think that have come out from what you've said, and also one or two of the other questions. I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the trajectory of this discussion. I mean, reflecting on the fact that out of our 160 attendees, half of them are students and by nature probably young people. Reflecting back 10, 20 years ago, I can't imagine that type of interest in young people in this subject. It might have been one that was somewhat esoterically discussed amongst the halls of human geographers or social scientists. But actually, there seems to be something that's really changed in society, and a lot of that does seem to be encapsulated by young or younger people now. And I just wondered, again, much like the Civic University has its moment arrived, and implied in your talk, is this the moment for it, and what role do young people have to play in that?
So I agree with you. I think that's a really interesting thing to reflect on. I think there's two angles to it for me. One is that everything that we see tells us that the what we might call the younger, we're living with so many generations at a time now, but the generation of people who are students now or who are young people in the workplace now have a view about the type of society that they want to work in and a sense of urgency, want to live in, and a sense of urgency about that, which I think is distinctive. And while it may be not dissimilar to some of what we saw back in the 60s, I think it is different from my own recollection of being part of that generation 20, 30 years ago. We also know that young people have got quite a different sense than those of their parents, and again, this is a generalisation, but the data does seem to bear it out, about what their own personal good life would be. And I know as an employer, latterly an employer in government of many thousands of people, that conversations we had with our graduate entrants, as well as our modern apprentice entrants, about the place of work in their life overall was quite different from the types of conversations we were having when I started work. So I think, yes, there is a moment there. And the interest that there is in these conversations may well be an important one. And the other thing which I think is important to say, which is also about the role of the university, comes back to the question of what type of teaching are we giving people about these issues. It's particularly relevant when thinking about social scientists and about economists. One of the things which I know causes concern to some in the wellbeing movement is that the teaching of economics has not been updated over the years to keep parallel with the growth of understanding about wellbeing approaches. And I would hope that universities and other educational institutions are able to meet their students where they are and ensure that their curriculum is one which is supporting people who want to go out and remould the world and change the world and make it into the world that they want for future generations. And I think one of the most important things, and I maybe didn't stress it tonight as much as I might have done on other occasions, one of the most important things about a wellbeing approach is it is both about now and it is about the future. And it's no coincidence that the Welsh legislation governing this is called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are all about those. So I agree, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about in that sense. And I feel very privileged and excited to have an opportunity to meet a coming generation that wants to be part of that journey.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah. I think that's a really great place and a really optimistic note on which to end your presentation and discussion this evening, looking forward, and a particularly pertinent challenge, I think, to universities when thinking, well, we are going through really rigorous thoughts about our curriculum for a whole variety of reasons, but thinking about how that curriculum reflects the challenge of living up to the challenge that young people are presenting to us as we're looking ahead towards a better society. So thanks very much for that thought, and also for your really fascinating lecture this evening. Just before you go, just a couple of announcements and also some thanks in particular to those that have supported this evening's session. I'm particularly grateful to those, not myself, I hasten to add, who have been involved in the technical aspects of this and the smooth running of the event, and also those that have helped arrange Sarah to come here, or come here virtually at least. And that's Rob Stannard, our Liberal Arts Programme Director, Helen Cuddy in our events and conferencing team, and Scott and Matt in our AVS team, and also Steve Kilner, who works for the Institute for Liberal Arts and Scientists and Science. Most of all, thank you to our audience as well, although we can't see you all, and that really is a disappointment, because one of the real pleasures of our normal events is that we can chat informally afterwards and meet you, and you get a chance to speak to Sarah in person. But I'm assured you're out there, so thank you very much. Thank you for your really insightful questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of them. We will pass them all on to Sarah, and she may want to reflect and give some individual answers back, but it's been a really fascinating discussion. So just before we close, just to let you know about our next event, which should be up on the screen now, I think, which is on the 3rd of March, again the same time, obviously, again in a virtual online format as we've had this evening, beginning at 6 o'clock. And that is from our own Professor Cliff Stott, who is a professor within our School of Psychology here at Keele University. His title is Are We All in It Together? Policing Human Rights, Security and Democracy During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Those of you who know Cliff will know that he plays an important part as one of the SAGE advisory subgroups, SBIPB, feeding into the policing and security advice to the government during the COVID crisis. He's also played a key role in advising around policing matters in Hong Kong in the last 2 years. Obviously a particularly interesting and fascinating area to be in, and he's also previously had a lot of expertise looking at crowds and policing around football and other sporting events. So Cliff is giving our Grand Challenge lecture on the 3rd of March, and I think I've got the pleasure again of hosting that. So I really look forward to that then. So I think that's all the duties I've got this evening, other than to give a final thanks to Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a shame we can't meet you in person, but please do take up the invitation to come and visit us at Kiel, where we can continue this discussion in a more face-to-face format in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night to everybody.
Thank you.